Everybody, welcome to the University of Regina. It's great to see everybody here. As was mentioned, the presentation is being filmed, and so Q&A either during the presentation or after will be captured by film and made publicly available for those who couldn't make it to today's talk. So my name is Sean Tucker. I'm a professor here at the university and also have a role at the WCB coordinating research. I want to acknowledge that we're meeting on Treaty 4 territory this afternoon. And this is the traditional lands of the Cree, Dakota, and also the homeland of the Métis people. And on the note of land recognition, I want to bring to your attention an important conference that's going to be happening at the University of Regina October 10th to 11th. It's called Who's Settlement. And one of the guest speakers for that conference is Cindy Blackstock, who some of you may have known from the news, an important human rights case. She'll be speaking to that, I think, here. So I want to bring that to your attention. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Paul Demers with us today. Paul is a leading researcher in Canada for occupational disease. He's also an expert around the world and has represented Canada at many meetings around the world. Paul is a director of the Occupational Cancer Research Centre in Toronto. He's also a senior scientist in prevention, screening, and cancer control at the Cancer Care Ontario, and a professor with the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. He also has a faculty affiliation with UBC in British Columbia. So Paul, thank you very much for coming. This is Paul's second talk today. And thank you very much for doing this. We had over 60 people out this morning, and it was a great turnout this afternoon. So come on in. Welcome.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming here today. The one thing nicer about this morning was we had windows and could see this beautiful weather outside, which I'm very appreciative of arriving here today. I'm going to talk about maybe I'll give a moment for our latest guest here to arrive. So I don't know if you do conflict of interest statements here at your seminars at the university. It's become increasingly common for people at least to say where their funding is from. And so that's what I've done here. It's a bit of acknowledgement at the same time. The research that I'm presenting today has been primarily funded by the Canadian Cancer Society, which funded the research, but also funds our center based in Toronto, although we're also funded by the Ontario Ministry of Labour and Cancer Care Ontario, which is our provincial cancer agency. And also some of the data that I'm presenting today is actually from CareX Canada. It's a project that I started at the University of British Columbia when I was there. Until about 10 years ago I was there. And that research is actually funded by the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer, which is funded by actually by Health Canada. So what I'm going to talk today is a little bit about occupational cancer, a little bit of background in general on occupational cancer, and actually the role that the International Agency for Research on Cancer plays in classifying carcinogens and in some of the work that we do. And then I'm going to talk about our Burden of Occupational Cancer project, talk about the number of cancers that are happening annually in Canada due to some of the most common workplace carcinogens and well-recognized ones, how many people are still exposed today, and some of the issues that I see around prevention of those cancers. I thought I'd start off here, and I'm used to talking in front of a health audience, and I know there's a bit of a mix here of folks. So it is important, I think, to think about just how much and how big an issue cancer is in Canada. You know, oftentimes we think of cancer as being something that's very rare, that impacts very few of us. And yet, when you look at these numbers and you see that there's over 200,000 new cases of cancer being diagnosed each year in Canada, that roughly half of us in this room will be diagnosed with cancer in our lifetimes, and roughly a quarter of us we predict will die from cancer unless things change and treatment is improved. It means that, you know, as we get older and we're living longer because we're not dying of things like heart disease, cancer is more likely to catch up with us. But it means that this is going to remain a very, very important issue. And thinking about things that are avoidable, that we can try to stop, that would lead to cancer later on in our lives is very important. Now, how do we know what causes cancer? It is a question that comes up, and you know, it's funny, cancer is a bit of a strange disease. We don't have lists of things that cause most diseases, and we think a lot about prevention of other diseases, but cancer is somewhat unique in that there are organizations that have formal lists of what causes cancer, both what has well-established relationships with cancer, what are probable carcinogens, and things like that. And these help drive the regulation of cancer worldwide. I have 3 of the organizations listed here. I should point, I'm pointing to this little screen over here because it's the one that I can see, but you're looking at the one over here. The International Agency for Research on Cancer is the most widely recognized international classifier of carcinogenesis. The U.S. National Toxicology Program is also a very good program for doing this. It's based in the United States, and not many people really look at it outside of the United States. The American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, the ACGIH, also has lists of what causes cancer, and that's often used by regulatory agencies in occupational health, but not necessarily outside of that. The agency that I look to, and I've been members of committees, expert committees for all 3 of these organizations, the one that I look to have the most definitive classifications and that make the biggest impact on health would be the International Agency for Research on Cancer. When I went there many years ago as a research fellow, I was there for a couple of years. At that time they did a survey, and when IARC classifies something as a human carcinogen, at that time it had a regulatory impact on 127 countries around the world would react to their classification. If anything, it is bigger now. With something where there is such a big regulatory reaction, of course there's always going to be controversies, there's always going to be arguments about how IR classifies things, but it still remains our most important source for the classification of what does and does not cause cancer. Now, for those of you who are interested in IR classifications, they used to produce these kind of big books here that are what they call monographs. So they call their classification program the monograph program, which I always thought was a little silly, but you know, you start saying it enough times and you get used to it. These monographs, each one of these books comes out of a single meeting of IARC. So they put together a scientific panel on either one substance or a group of related substances. The scientific committee writes this thing from scratch and produces and goes through several drafts of it in the course of about a 10-day meeting that happens in Lyon, France. That group is called a working group, and in fact it is a very hard working group, although it's quite an honor to get asked to be involved in the process because of the impact it does have. There's few things that I've been involved in that have this big of an impact. Here you see some of those monographs now. Now they're freely available for download on the internet if you want to take a look at them. You can probably find these orange covered things in a lot of libraries, but increasingly we're just relying upon the electronic. IARC has reviewed about a little over 1,000 different agents. And they use the term agents because some of these things are chemicals, some of these things are different forms of radiation, some of these things are what we call exposure circumstances, like working at night, which can involve disruption of circadian rhythms and other things like that. So there are a lot of different things that IARC reviews for carcinogenicity. But they reviewed about 1,000 of them. It's often portrayed as a very radical program. These 1,000 things only come to IARC because people are concerned about them. And when I say people, it's usually the governments of the industrialized countries of the world, which are the ones that actually fund IARC. It's a specialized agency of the World Health Organization, but it's funded through the contributions of the wealthiest countries in the world that all each contribute to it. They submit candidates to be reviewed by IARC because there is a reason to be concerned about them. And yet, as 1,000 things went there, 12% of those or so got classified as being group 1, or definite human carcinogens, another 8% probable human carcinogens. And then the other 80% are not classified as being carcinogens, 30% possibly carcinogens. Most of those are ones where there's animal or experimental evidence, but not enough human evidence. And 50% of those get classified as not enough evidence to place them anywhere at all. So that's how IARC's classifications shake out, or have shaked out over the decades. And an amazing percentage of those 1,000 and something different agents that have been reviewed are commonly encountered in workplaces. Roughly half of the things reviewed by IARC have been encountered in workplaces. So this is from a paper that we're currently preparing for publication. And what you see here are, I'm told to use this. So you see here the group 1s. These are the definite human carcinogens, the ones for which IARC thinks there's definitive evidence of carcinogenicity. Half of those classifications were based upon studies that were done in workplaces. And that's because in workplaces, we're usually exposed to chemicals at 10 or 100 or 1,000 times higher than the general population. Workplaces are where the highest levels of exposure generally occur. There's some exceptions, but it's generally where the highest exposures occur. So the epidemiology that drives that is this dark thing that means the human studies of cancer in people. Half of those things were classified on the basis of workplace studies. And then these other categories are that in the monograph there is discussion of people being exposed and data presented in that way. So there's over half in group 1. Group 2, it reduces a bit in terms of human evidence because often things in group 2A, there's not enough human evidence to actually drive it, drive the classification. Still, workplace studies of people exposed plays an important role. And roughly 2/3 of those things that are considered probable human carcinogens are encountered commonly in workplaces. And I could go on and describe the other categories as well. Many of these things are industrial chemicals encountered in various forms. Some things that I have not even listed here are things like the chemicals that we use, or I call them chemicals. Most people call them pharmaceuticals that we use to treat cancer patients. Many of those are actually carcinogenic. If you're a cancer patient, hey, it's worth the risk. These are really powerful drugs, and they do help lengthen people's lives who have cancer. But to the healthcare worker, they're a carcinogenic exposure and a hazard, and something that we have to protect those healthcare workers from. So there are a lot of things that are out there that are encountered in workplaces that are very important to consider. So this is just to say that IARC has been around here for a number of decades and plays a very important role in occupational health. Looking through different control things, here we go. This is an example. The lung is the most common site for a lot of different workplace exposures to hit. when we're in workplaces, we're not eating things. We're trying not to get things on our skin usually, although that does happen, and there are a number of skin carcinogens, or things absorbed through the skin. But the most common thing is that we inhale chemicals that are in the air, fibers, dust. We inhale those into our lungs, and the first place they hit in your body is the lungs or other parts of the respiratory system. And so what you see here are a lot of different things that have been established by IARC as being either established lung carcinogens, which is this first set over here, or suspected lung carcinogens, which are over here. Sure. People are getting some email messages on the computer.
Can't do it.
Technology is not cooperating with us. The things I've bolded here are things I'm going to talk about a little later on today. These are some of the most common workplace carcinogens that are in Canada that result in the most cases of cancer, and I've listed them here in bolded. The things I have in italics are things that IARC calls exposure circumstances, and I mentioned shift work as being one of those as a cause of suspected cause of breast cancer, but you'll see things like welding and painting and other things like that that are where we see a fairly consistent increased risk of lung cancer in groups of workers, but they've not been tied to a single type of exposure. Anyway, this is just to give you some examples, and IARC does its classifications on the basis of cancer site. So if you want to look through and see, well, what causes cancer of the larynx, or of the ovary, or of the stomach, or anything like that, you can actually go to the IARC website and look at their classifications and see those classifications and see where they shake out in terms of different parts of the body. Oh, I wonder if I did this, that I. How about if I locate around there? I'm just going to do this. The roller thing works. Keep all my control items over here. So what I'm going to talk about now is our Burden of Occupational Cancer project. I mentioned that this is funded by the Canadian Cancer Society, which is our leading kind of charitable organization in the area of cancer. It funds a lot of cancer research in this country. One reason that I like the Canadian Cancer Society is that it's one of the few cancer charitables that also funds prevention research and considers that important. There are groups like, Prostate Cancer Canada, they only fund treatment. They don't fund anything on prevention. So the Canadian Cancer Society, I'm a very big fan of. Our idea in doing this Burden of Occupational Cancer project was to try to take a comprehensive look at the things that have been well established as causes of workplace cancer and try to look at what their impact is on cancer in Canada. How many cases are they causing? What proportion of cases do they cause? And that kind of thing. So our idea was to look at kind of a wide range of different things. We see here, this isn't all the things we looked at, but kind of a sample of them around this figure of the human body. There we go. This was a national team project. So when we put this together, we got what we thought were the best people in the area of occupational cancer and occupational exposure research around the country. And we also got involved a group of health economists who really focus in on workplace issues. So our health economists were from the Institute for Work and Health. And then you see the other universities and agencies here that were involved in this project. So primarily we have people here from Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, where some of the major groups are around the country. We also had excellent support from our colleagues in the UK who've done a similar project in the UK. Thought maybe I was going backwards. No, I just used this slide again. We decided from the get-go that we weren't going to do our own decisions about what does or does not cause cancer. And to simplify things, we're going with the IARC classifications. So again, we were just going to use IARC's classifications and the things that IARC says occur in workplaces. Now, the actual determination of how many cases are caused are really related to a fairly, simple looking, at least for most, or for some, formula that looks like this. This is the attributable risk formula that was established back in the 1950s. And it looks very simple, but let me see if this works. No. And it has basically two components. Oh. Two components that I thought were automated to be in here. Oops.
Got it there, yeah.
Oh, okay. Actually, okay. Back. There we go. Ah, and I've circled them here. Just had enough buttons around here somewhere, you're going to get this. One is the proportion of people exposed who have been exposed in the past to these workplace carcinogens. This is the difficult part of this equation. How many people in the past were exposed to asbestos, to diesel engine exhaust, to crystalline silica? We don't have good survey data for this to go around the country. There have been some very specific studies, but nothing that we could generalize to the full country. So that was our major area of challenge. The second area was trying to identify what is the relative risk. So what is the risk associated with those exposures? And we got those from looking at epidemiologic studies, that is, studies of cancer in workers that were conducted preferably in Canada or North America, or at least results that we think would be relevant to the Canadian workplace experience. Now, which button did I hit? I'm going to go, oh, hey, this is working now. Okay. So this is the challenge, right? We're trying to do that, and I put we have a target year that we're trying to estimate how many people are exposed in. Cancer takes a while to develop. The exposures in more recent years, just prior to when somebody's diagnosed, are things that we're not that concerned about. But we're concerned about exposures that occurred over a long period of time prior to that. So that's our area of interest. It's this, what they call the risk exposure period. Now, I'm not going to hit people with too many methods here, and I'm probably going to hit people with too many for your liking, but I am going to just quickly say how we got these things, just in case anybody is curious, and then I'm going to move on to the results. To decide about what industries and occupations exposures occurred in, we use results from Carrix Canada. So this is a project that has been funded over the last 15 years or so by the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer and by some other organizations like WorkSafe BC and some other groups over time. So it's a project that I worked on starting many, many years ago and still goes on now, but now has people involved across the country. And what we did is create what we call a job exposure matrix. And it may not be a term that anybody has heard here, but it's how we often assign levels of exposure in a study. We look at what people's industry and occupation is, and then we try to assign what's their level of exposure and what proportion of people were exposed. And we did this for 328 different industries by 520 different occupations as part of the Carrix project. So it was years of work putting that together. And what we did then is we went back and we said, well, how do we apply this? And I'm just going to go through this very quickly. We looked at this, we applied it, had to translate it into the different coding systems that were used by Statistics Canada when they do the census, because we used census information to decide who was employed in what industries and occupations in Canada. We then applied this over the decades to different slices of the population, and then tried to determine how many people were exposed in each of those years and the years in between. Then we added in different information into this. We knew then what industries and occupations people were in. We knew what the gender was of those people that were involved. And we added in age as well. We know what province they were in. And what we get is a very detailed picture of the labor force over time and how many people were exposed. And what you see here is that our labor force has not been the same over time. And this is just looking at age. So people are working older now than they used to in the past, especially in some of these jobs where exposures occurred, where it used to be that people retired out early. There are more women working now. There are other different types of things that have happened over time. And our model tries to take all of that into account. But the other thing is, that's how many people were exposed in each year. We had to actually think, well, how many were exposed and how many were just new people coming into the industry. And that gives us the population of people that were potentially exposed, which grows year by year over time until we're no longer counting people because we're ignoring those last 10 years. And then unfortunately, not everybody lives till the end of the period. And so that gives us our number of people exposed. So for the students in the room, this is not going to be on the test, but it will be, it's something that is a lot of work. In essence, what we're having to do here is having to use different statistical models and as much data as possible to try to estimate how many people were exposed to these carcinogens in the past. You know, as an example, this is the current numbers that we're estimating for exposure to diesel engine exhaust. Diesel engine exhaust, as I'll talk about in a little bit, is a lung carcinogen, and a fairly common one. So this is information from Canada. Yeah, I'm always a little nervous not touching any of these things. What you see here is the size of these circles represents where exposure to diesel exhaust occurs. The biggest single group are people in transportation. How dark the color is how high their level of exposure is. The high exposures are in mining, oil and gas, but primarily in mining and in underground mining. That's because we use very heavy-duty equipment. You put it in an underground mine where there's ventilation in order to get oxygen down there, but not enough ventilation to take away all the exhaust fumes from that very heavy-duty diesel equipment operating in a very enclosed space. Anyway, this gives you an idea of how many people and in what different sectors they were in for exposure. Historically, when we add all this up, there was 1.35 million people who have been exposed to low levels of diesel engine exhaust, about 200,000 to moderate levels, and about 56,000 to high levels of diesel exhaust, primarily in mining in this country. And mining is a very big industry, particularly in, well, certainly in Ontario, where we have a lot of underground mining. So what you see here is 6.8% of the people who were of working age who were alive in 2011 had a history of diesel exhaust exposure. We used a study, an international study, but it was primarily US studies that were in it to look at what the risk is associated with these levels of exhaust. And we come up with an estimate of 560 lung cancers happening every year in Canada due to diesel exhaust exposure. Almost none of those recognized in any way, shape, or form because it was only in recent years that we began to realize that diesel exhaust is a lung carcinogen. So as not to kind of create too much suspense, this is kind of summary for all of Canada for our top 10 different carcinogens. And I'll go through most of these one by one. This report is available on the internet, free, 100 pages of really not so fun reading, but if you're interested in seeing this, there's multiple pages on each one of these carcinogens to read through. So I welcome people to take a look at those at your leisure. So don't worry about writing down the numbers there. They are publicly available. But you actually see here that together, these top 10 carcinogens cause about 10,000 cases of work-related cancer a year in Canada. And you would think, because these are all very well recognized carcinogens, that there wouldn't be many people currently exposed. But that last column is how many people we estimate are still exposed, maybe not to the highest levels, but exposed enough where it's a hazard to them, and we have to think about their protection at work from exposure. So 10,000 cases of cancer due to historic exposure, but millions of people still exposed to workplace carcinogens in Canada today. And the first one that I'll talk about for a minute or two should come as no surprise to anyone. It's asbestos. It remains our #1 workplace killer, and it probably exceeds any the risk of traumatic injury in Canada. Certainly, when you add it up across the country, more people die of cancer from asbestos than they die of injuries in the workplace on an annual basis. So this is a big one. You see here about 480 mesotheliomas that are due to, is it 480, 430? I should wear my glasses, I can never decide. Oh yeah, 430 cases of mesothelioma per year in Canada. Now that's not all the mesotheliomas in Canada, because
what are
mesotheliomas. Mesothelioma is a cancer of the lining of the lung. And it's considered historically a rare cancer. It's not so rare now. We certainly have rarer cancers. What happens is the asbestos fibers pass through the lung and they hit the lining of the lung, also the lining of the stomach cavity, and other linings within the body are a type of tissue that's susceptible to these asbestos fibers. Unfortunately, almost everybody who gets this cancer dies within a year. Average survival is about 9 months. This is one of the nastiest cancers that we have. And that 430 mesotheliomas, those are due to workplace, but there's also people exposed to environmental asbestos as well. So there are more cases out there for that. And this is our numbers based upon the kind of the year that we started this project. We're collecting all of our statistics, and every year the number of mesotheliomas is going up in Canada, although we think that that is hopefully about to hit the plateau now in terms of that. But it's not going down, and it's not going to go down for a while. This is a bit of an old slide. Canada actually did ban asbestos in December of last year. So we finally are in the situation where asbestos is banned in Canada. That's good. That'll be good for people 50 or 60 years from now. But there's a lot of asbestos that's still out there that we have to worry about. And that asbestos is in a lot of our buildings. It's in our housing. It's in a lot of our industrial buildings, and certainly it is in a lot of our public buildings. Pretty much any of our public buildings and much of our housing that was built, let's say prior to about the mid-1970s, is going to have asbestos and substantial amounts of asbestos in various parts of the building. And that creates a real challenge for prevention. We made a decision way back that we weren't going to spend the money to remove that asbestos because we thought removing it would harm more people than it would protect. And as long as it was enclosed, that wasn't a problem. But that was over 30 years ago. And gradually buildings are getting older. And asbestos, as they get older, has the risk of escaping. So we have to worry now whenever we go into a building and have to modify that building in terms of remodeling, in terms of tearing things down or adding on to things, that we may be encountering asbestos. Saskatchewan has actually a register of where asbestos is in public buildings. What we're recommending coming out of this report is that we need both a national register like that, but that it should be expanded and not be just public buildings. Public buildings were the easiest to think about because they're very easily under government control in terms of doing that. But we have to really think of at least all workplaces, and we have to even think about our homes and where those are and where asbestos is there. Now, we have a ban on asbestos, but there is a lot left to do. BC has established an interministerial working group which involves people in public health, ministries of environment and labor and all these other things to work together on the broader issues of how we're disposing of asbestos, where asbestos is occurring, how the public is impacted as well as just workers. So there is a lot of work to be done to continue to prevent asbestos exposure. Everything is working on it. This is great. I mentioned before that we had economists involved in this, and this is what they estimated was the annual cost of asbestos disease being caused right now from just lung cancer and mesothelioma. Now there are many more lung cancers caused than mesothelioma cases in Canada. But what you see here is that the total cost of these things, as valued by an economist, which considers not just the direct medical cost, but also how we value years of life lost to the person, the extra cost to caregivers and taking care of people, the families involved, the cost in terms of lost productivity and everything. But the single biggest here is health-related quality of life. How many years of good life are people losing to this exposure? And the total cost comes out to about sorry, I'm going to say this wrong. Okay, about $2.3 billion or so, $2.4 billion per year in costs, economic costs. So this is not a small hit. And when you consider this economic costs, I think any quibbling over the costs of prevention, I hope, should be a little bit laid to rest. This is something that we should be spending prevention dollars on. Now, the single biggest number of cases of cancer are being caused by sun exposure. This is not necessarily killing a lot of people, but it is making a lot of people miserable because this is actually non-melanoma skin cancer. For those of you who know anything about skin cancer, the most deadly form is a thing called malignant melanoma, and that is the most deadly form. But when we think of non-melanoma skin cancers, they're much, much more common, and they're more related to the kind of exposure you get from being an outdoor worker. So if any of you ever read The Old Man of the Sea, you'll know that the old man of the sea had skin cancer from being out on the water. This has always been recognized as a hazard for outdoor workers, not so recognized in terms of spending prevention dollars programmatically on it. So it's actually one of the more common things that we encounter in workplaces. There are about 1.5 million Canadians that work outdoors the majority of their lives. That certainly is true in agriculture, it's true in construction, public works, and a variety of other occupations. So there are a lot of people who work outdoors. We think that there's about 4,600 skin cancers per year caused by this, and that we should be starting to address this much more seriously by developing prevention programs in the workplace that recognize the hazards of this and then try to look at ways to provide shade at workplaces, to try to avoid work during the most intense sun periods in the day, and to take other activities to, for instance, even protective clothing and hats and things like that to reduce the risk of skin cancer among outdoor workers. Diesel engine exhaust, I mentioned 560 lung cancers, and we suspect an additional couple hundred bladder cancers. This is a cancer site that is less definitive, at least by IARC's calculation, but there certainly are cancer researchers out there that do believe that bladder cancer is caused by diesel engine exhaust as well. About 900,000 people out there are exposed to diesel engine exhaust at work. So again, this is a common workplace carcinogen. It's one that was classified as carcinogenic in around 2012. And we know from different scientific studies that it's the very small particles generated by diesel exhaust that are breathed deep into the lungs that cause this cancer. We still do not have regulations that are appropriate for regulating diesel engine exhaust exposure. Basically, there is not a jurisdiction in Canada that has this. There's some regulations in mining, but they're not at all close to what they need to be in order to protect against cancer. We've recommended as an interim level going down to 20 micrograms per meter cubed, which is not a lot of diesel exhaust in the air, but at least it would substantially reduce the risk of cancer if we could reduce it that level in mining, and we think we can go down to 1/4 of that in non-mining situations. In the meantime, what we need to be doing is moving towards upgrading our diesel equipment. Our on-road diesel equipment already is in the midst of being turned over and moving to much more efficient diesel engines that are putting out a lot less diesel into the air. But our off-road equipment we're much further behind on. It's more difficult to control diesel exhaust in off-road equipment, but we are making a lot of progress in that area in terms of research, and that's an important area for us to be looking at and retiring the equipment to the extent that we can, at the speed that we can, in order to reduce the impact of diesel emissions. Crystalline silica has been recognized for a couple of decades now as causing lung cancer. So crystalline silica is simply quartz in the air, fine quartz. It could be crystallite, another form of crystalline silica. The respirable form of it can get deep into the lungs. It causes silicosis, but it can also cause lung cancer. And it causes about the same number of annual cancers as does diesel engine exhaust. And we've known about it for a long time. Our regulations across the country are not very even in this area. Saskatchewan is at the good end of that, I believe, in terms of its regulations. But what we don't have enough of in Canada right now is the collecting of exposure measurements in workplaces to be able to track our progress in reducing our levels of exposure. So these are certainly our recommendations that we're putting forward across the country. Welding fumes are one of the most recently classified major lung carcinogens out there. For many years, we have regulated welding fumes on the basis of some of the toxic metals that are in welding fumes. So we've said, oh, it's the chromium, it's the nickel that's in welding fumes when you weld things like stainless steel. Our current understanding of the science is it's not just that. It's the fact that welding fumes are generating these ultra-fine, very small particles that, again, get very deep into the lungs. And any of those insoluble particles that get deep into the lungs seem to have the potential to increase the risk of lung cancer. And now what's happened is all welding fumes are classified as carcinogenic, but our regulations treat them as a nuisance rather than as a carcinogen. So our regulations have not kept up with the state of science on welding fumes. So that's definitely something that we really need to be moving towards. And increasing things like ventilation requirements and other things like that. So there are about 375,000 Canadians that we believe are exposed to welding fumes. So again, this is not a rare thing. Welding is a pretty common activity. Radon, some of you have probably heard that radon is considered to be the second most important cause of lung cancer in Canada. I think it's tied with asbestos, but not everybody agrees with me. But we believe that there still are about 200,000 or 190,000 people exposed to radon. And traditionally what we've worried about is people in mining, because when you're working below grade, that's where radon gas can build up. And that's traditionally where we've seen the highest levels of radon occur. But now you know that there's a lot, or at least if you watch things that come out of the Cancer Society and other organizations like the Lung Association, we worry a lot about residential radon. So we worry about radon that builds up in people's basements. And then in the winter, when you've got everything shut in, it's recirculated through our furnaces and is circulated around homes themselves. Now, that happens at homes, but what happens to our small businesses, not like necessarily retail where there's a lot of people going in and out, or some factories where maybe they have a lot of air also going in and out, but how about our offices and things like that? And if they're in high background areas, radon can also be going into their basements and also recirculated around. So radon has to be considered as a workplace issue in those areas as well. And it should be regulated as such, and we should be trying to keep those levels down, and so we're recommending regulatory limits there. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, for people who aren't in chemistry or things like that. These are kind of what you would see that are generated almost any time you burn what we call organic matter. And I don't mean pesticide-free matter, I mean anything that started off as a plant. Petrochemicals started off as plants. You burn petrochemicals, you burn wood, you burn, we were talking here about oil that happens in for cooking and things like that. You burn any of these materials, and what you get is kind of a black smoke that goes into the air. And that smoke contains polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. That's a mixture of known and suspected carcinogens, lung carcinogens. And really almost any place that you generate those kind of combustion products from burning things, we have to worry about ventilating those things so that people aren't breathing them in. In a sense, the one that people are all familiar with are things like cigarette smoke, where we're breathing in very directly. But in fact, it's not healthy to breathe in anything that's been burned. So we do need to implement controls to try to reduce the level of those in the workplace. Now, these aren't generating as big of numbers as some of the ones before, but still we're looking at over 250 cancers per year caused by the simple burning of different types of oils and organic material. Yes, please.
Just thinking back in the day when they still had wood burning stoves and fireplaces to heat their homes, were the rates as high? Like, how do the rates compare to back then to today, where homes didn't necessarily have giant hood vents over their wood stoves?
Well, it's a big issue still for places where people are burning stuff and cooking indoors around the world. So it may be a historic thing for us, but it's still very much a current health hazard for them. And it's a health hazard not just for cancer. You have to live long enough for cancer, but for lung disease and things like that. So yes, it has been an issue over time. Our lung cancer rates are overall at least beginning to come down now because of cigarette smoking going down and other things like that, despite the fact that we're living older. So I think it's, overall we're doing some things better, but it's something that certainly was a historic hazard as well.
And like old commercial kitchens are still fighting with language, like my husband's a chef, so, yeah.
Yeah, it's very important to have good ventilation in these kitchens, that's
Yeah.
for sure. And it's a health hazard, not just an aesthetics hazard or things like that people think of, but yeah.
So burning candles could be a problem.
Yeah, they're generating a lot less though than when you're burning, let's say you're burning a pan or things like that. So it is the amount that we're putting into the air. That is the bad thing. Just like, smoking one cigarette a day is not anywhere near as bad as 20 or 40 or 60 as we used to do. Not that it's good, I'm not supposed to say a cigarette's going to be as good, but there's quite a bit of difference in that. Are there other questions? I realize I've been conscious of the time. Yes?
Just out of curiosity, like how long do the pHs linger in the air, and do they like say if you're working as a server, does it linger on your clothes and you carry it with you, or does it linger on food and it carries?
So it doesn't linger in the air as long as some things. And I was presenting on asbestos a little earlier on today. We had a discussion over lunch about, how long is asbestos in the air? Asbestos stays in the air quite a long time and can easily get resuspended because it's just a very, very tiny fiber. These things, not necessarily, and they'll attach to different surfaces and things like that. They're not good for your skin, which is why you see skin cancer on here. Certainly we've known when you have oils on your skin, and indeed one of the first carcinogens, workplace carcinogens identified was soot in chimney sweeps. This goes way back to that. And those same chemicals that cause cancer of the skin or scrotum in chimney sweeps, because their whole clothes were saturated. That's the same kind of stuff that is also in the air that we're breathing in as well as getting in our skin. Yes, please.
Do these statistics account for the compounding effects, or are they all isolated? Because I work in construction, I have a wood burning stove, and I also like to go out in the sun. So are these just isolated results or estimates, I guess?
Yeah, they are isolated, and there are two reasons for that. One is it'd be really hard to unisolate them.
Yeah.
But the other one is that when we do prevention measures, we often focus them in on a single thing. So we think, okay, the prevention efforts that we take for the sun are going to be very different than we do for this. So one of the reasons for doing this project overall was to push the message of prevention, that the only way to lower these numbers in the future is to prevent those exposures now. Any other questions while I pause my yakking here for a minute?
Hi, Warren Freddie. Thanks for talking about mining. I'm from Timmins, Ontario, a big mining town.
Oh, yeah.
And so something that struck me back 20, 30 years ago, somebody was doing a study on lung cancer in miners. So you mentioned, the exposure distribution and the fumes, except the issue back in the 80s was a lot of them smoked because it was so dusty in the mine that people thought that, smoking relieved their lungs. And that, right? So how do you get rid of that? How do you get rid of that other factor? Or when you're taking this into account?
Well, there's two things. One is I do studies of miners, and what we do is we compare miners to miners.
Okay.
And adjust for calendar periods and, when people were, for their ages and things like that, to try to compare people as similarly as possible except for what they mined and the risks of different miners. Subgroups of miners are quite different. In this, We're not able to always control for the impacts of smoking, but we try to take our relative risk, that RR that was in the formula, we try to take that whenever possible from studies that did adjust for the impact of smoking. We don't always have that, but that's what we try to do in order to adjust for those effects. But you're right, it is tough. I mean, the other thing in mining is, particularly in underground mining in Northern Ontario, oftentimes we're mining, we might be mining uranium, or we were mining uranium, we aren't anymore, you're doing it here. But when we were mining uranium, when we were mining nickel, when you're mining gold, there's arsenic. Those are all lung carcinogens, and then you add on to those crystalline silica from the rock and diesel exhaust, and what you end up doing is getting that mixture that adds to your risk. So we need to target each of those things for the prevention measures that we can. Yes, please.
I find this is terrific, so thank you. Most of these agents that you're talking about today have been identified through longitudinal studies. What's the next in the, and maybe you're going to get to that in your presentation. IARC still has 500 substances that they continue to look at.
Yeah.
So what's the next sort of things that are on our radar, if you will, in the sense that are carcinogens or could reach that the magnitude of the asbestos and the silica?
It'd be tough to reach the magnitude of asbestos, I hope. Although it's something we worry about. When I was a member of the TLB committee back in the day, one of the things that I think we were being threatened with being sued on was when we treated refractory ceramic fibers very harshly in terms of it. But what we were seeing was, when we're looking at very small fibers, and we're seeing that in different types of workers, and then you look at the animal studies and you start to see cases of mesothelioma coming up in the animal studies. None of us wanted to be responsible for the next asbestos, so we came down hard on things in that way. And I think that's the way we have to be going into the future, is really to be proactive about these things, try to look for the early warning signs and go for it. The stuff that is, and let's just see where I'm at here. Shift work is one where it's not a definite human carcinogen, and I think it's a very, very important one. So it is one here where you're seeing, again, a big impact. In part, it's a combined impact that, for those of us who work during the day in regular things, I told you I wasn't going to wander around and start pointing at the screen, but I just can't help myself. Around, almost 2 million people in Canada work permanent nights, rotating shifts involving nights, or permanent evening shifts. And what they get as part of their work is disruption of circadian rhythms. It is something that we're very concerned about from a cancer point of view, because a lot of our cancers, including cancers of the breast, hormone, but a number of other ones as well, are hormone sensitive. And you start screwing with hormone levels in people's bodies, and you can change their risk of cancer. Now, that's the first thing that has been looked at systematically for shift work is breast cancer in women. And the evidence here is not getting weaker, despite the fact that some of our press will suddenly play up one study of this and another study of that. On the whole, the evidence has gradually been getting stronger. And in fact, the U.S. National Toxicology Program has moved to say that shift work at night is a definite cause of breast cancer in women. So IARC is a little more conservative than that. They're holding back on that. But the debate at IARC wasn't in going backwards. It was a split in the room between people who said, yes, this does cause breast cancer, versus those who said, no, the evidence isn't quite there yet. There are dozens of animal studies where this is the case, where you disrupt hormonal, the circadian rhythms of rodents, and you get an increased risk of breast cancer in rodents, and the same mechanism appears to operate in humans. Yes?
So how, like with the health region, with like everything involving health, how do you bring those numbers down? Because the majority of nurses and care aides are female. And male aren't common, and like, I am a care aide, I used to work shift work, I've done the graveyard and the evenings and the days, and flip-flop back and forth.
And we don't have, there's a challenge in that, over the, one, we cannot get rid of healthcare workers at night. We need healthcare at night. We need some of the other services that we have at night. There are some things that we could stop operating at night, but there are some things, public safety, it happens and has to operate at night. The evidence regarding shift work and breast cancer are people who worked 20 to 30 years of night shifts.
And I've worked with those people.
Yeah, so there's definitely that's out there. Right now there is different types of research that is going on trying to look at how we can prevent that. But I'll tell you, it's not an easy area to work on. Some things have focused in on trying to get people to shift to being more nocturnal if they have to work at night. That is not easy to do in a human being, especially not in somebody who has a family or other things like that. It means you have to sleep in total darkness at night, and that's not easy to do. The military does it, but they control 24 hours of your life when you work for the military, and they can have a lot more control than we could ever have over any other kind of thing like that. And those are not necessarily folks living with their families either. So there are real challenges in doing this and a lot of different experiments. There is no good answer for how do we prevent this going forward.
Just a quick question, follow up on this. Are you aware of the status of claims and workers' compensation boards around this? Have there been claims accepted for shift work and cancer?
Not that I know of in Canada. In Denmark, and I understand some of the European countries, it's beginning to come up. Denmark is definitely compensated cases before. I think claims are starting to be received, if I understand it right, but I don't know of accepted claims in Canada yet for this.
Very interesting, very interesting.
But this is one of these upcoming issues that, and deals with taking this broader view, whereas traditionally we've thought about, work as being all about chemicals and other things, but can be involved, a lot of things are involved in work. So this is a very important one for us. So we suspect that there may be up to 1,200, but there's a lot of variabilities in these studies, and so it may be lower than this. There's a lot of range that's going on here. But this is an area that's very actively being researched in a number of countries around the world still. Oh, I threw this up because I gave you national numbers, and these are the numbers that we would get for the population just of Saskatchewan. Just to give you a bit of an idea of how that shakes down when it comes to our things like sun exposure. You have a lot of outdoor people here because of not high amount of agriculture, for instance, but let's say less for asbestos and some other things as well. But this is just to give you those kind of numbers. Our report actually does present number of cases by province. If you want to take a look at the report, it covers a few carcinogens that I haven't talked about here. This is what the report looks like. And you see September 2019, so it's only been out, I think for about 2 weeks now. It includes the stuff I've been presenting to you now in terms of number of cancers diagnosed annually, new cancers that are due to these workplace exposures, a number of workers that are currently exposed, and some ways that we can prevent exposure. It includes kind of a breakdown of what industries we're attributing those exposures to. So in this case, this is crystalline silica, and where people had worked with crystalline silica that we believe would have caused their lung cancer. So you see construction, which isn't surprising given the large size of the construction sector historically, and the levels of dust that were there. Manufacturing, though, is also quite a large contributor, mining as well, and other industries. We provide maps, so this is the asbestos map for lung cancer. And so you see the number of cases here from that. So this will be in there for each of the cancers that are there, along with the number of people currently exposed and what industry sectors they are in. Although you can also visit the Carcinogens Canada site for this. And we talk a little bit about some of the emerging issues here. And so I was kind of holding off on the question from the back row. One controversial area that IARC has been dealing with lately is pesticides. And that's going to be, I think, continue to be a big issue. People may have heard about the controversies over glyphosate, our most widely used herbicide in the world. Has now been classified as a probable human carcinogen by IARC based upon both human and animal studies. Now, it's not there all the way to being a definite human carcinogen, but it is a very big issue, in part because Monsanto, the manufacturer of this chemical, has also genetically modified plants to be resistant to glyphosate. So you can spray them with them, they do fine, and it kills the weeds around them. That's what genetic modification does. That means there's a huge investment that they've made into the future of this, and that's made this a huge economic issue. And when there are huge economic forces at play, you get things going on. Yeah. But there are 3 major lawsuits that have gone with people who, or the families of people who had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in California, I believe. And so they are being sued over this. And this is not going to really go away as a topic. But there are other pesticides that have come up that are still in relatively wide use that are either suspected or known to cause non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So certainly that's going to be a big issue. You know, things like stress are certainly things that are being researched. The evidence is a bit mixed on physical activity and work, in that it's probably healthy to be physically active at work, but sedentary work is probably not that good for you. On the other hand, working all day standing is not that good for you. So there are things that are fairly complicated to study in terms of health issues around physical activity at work. But certainly that is also there. I mentioned the anti-neoplastic drugs. These are cancer drugs. There's a lot of interest in that. A lot of healthcare workers potentially exposed. Pharmacists potentially exposed as well. Nanomaterials are a thing that we used to talk of just a few decades ago as something that is exotic, something we're doing research on in laboratories, and now it's in paint. and it's being used all over the place. It's in cosmetics, we're using nanomaterials. Nanomaterials are now being used commercially. Now usually they're often embedded in things, but you know, the things embedded can come loose. But there are other concerns about a lot of these very, very small nanotubules in particular, that when you look at nanotubules under a microscope, they look a lot like asbestos. And looking like asbestos is not a good thing. It hasn't been a good thing for the natural things that look like asbestos, that one by one we have decided cause cancer, and any of the artificial things that we made is not a good idea. So nanomaterials are going to continue these kind of really artificial materials that have amazing properties, self-cleaning surfaces, things like that. People are falling in love with the industrial process, properties of these things, while other people are worried that they have not been sufficiently studied to be released on the market. So, it's, cancer research is not going away as a business if anybody wants to join. Yeah. I just wanted to end it today, and then we could have more questions, by saying that I've focused in on a lot of the traditional well-established causes of cancer, but there are a number of other things out there that we think about where they certainly do represent, we think that there is a carcinogenic risk. And I have some of them here today, certainly things that pharmacists are dealing with. Traditionally, many of the hair dyes that we dealt with are not particularly healthy, and certainly as a workplace issue are there, and historic, people who were, there's evidence for an increased risk of cancer among hairdressers. Trichloroethylene, which we've used in dry cleaning and degreasing operations, is a kidney carcinogen. There are a lot of different things out there that we worry about, and they impact a lot of different people in different walks of life. In case anybody's interested, Canada this year is the host of the World Congress on Safety and Health at Work. I should have used this slide this morning where there was more WCB and ministry people there, but certainly it is going to be, it's one of the biggest meetings on health and safety at work in the world. It'll be about 5,000 people, and it's rarely in Canada. It hasn't been, I don't know ever that it's been in Canada. I'm sure that it probably has been, but it certainly is a really good opportunity for people to go to this in Toronto if you like. And we're part of organizing an epidemiology and occupational health meeting, which I know is, there will not be 5,000 people at. There will be hundreds of us. We're really, really dedicated to it. But if anybody's interested in that, I'm happy to answer questions. But I also just wanted to start by, or end by saying thank you to the funders of my center, and also to the students and staff in the center who, as well as our collaborators around the country that have worked on these projects and who've done the majority of the work, and I'm just more the person presenting these days. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
How many cancers are there that have no known causes? I know Hodgkin's used to be one of them.
There are, roughly half of all cancers these days we think are preventable. But there's a lot of things we haven't studied yet. So there are, non-Hodgkin's is certainly one. Colorectal cancer is one where we think diet is in there, but it's not been adequately studied. Prostate cancer, weirdly enough, which has become one of the more common cancers, has not been adequately studied. Breast cancer has been studied for some things, but not for others. So there's still lots of big gaps. But there were lots of areas of knowledge, of new knowledge, outside of the area of occupation. So we're
Yeah.
looking a lot more at infectious disease agents, so human papillomavirus. My friends who study human papillomavirus feel as though we could eliminate cervical cancer altogether by eliminating human papillomavirus, which is why we're pushing for vaccinating very, very young kids before they can even, many of us get human papillomavirus you're around enough, know enough people, you're going to get human papillomavirus. So you have to catch your people early. So our knowledge is always increasing, but the stuff we know about now is responsible for about half of cancers. If that helps.
Yeah, I had Hodgkin's 9 years ago, and there was no known cause at the time, and I did a lot of reading, and I saw that they outlawed coal tar in the UK and other parts of Europe, and they saw the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma rates drop by 20%. So I eliminated coal tar from my life as much as I could, but that's still an unknown.
There's certainly, it's a tough one. It's one of the cancers, cancer overall is increasing because we're living longer, but there are some cancers, specifically like non-Hodgkin's, which we've seen increase.
And there's like 30 different kinds of non-Hodgkin's, right?
Yeah. And they all might have different causes.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I've done research on is a thing called pentachlorophenol that we use as a preserved wood. We still allow it in Canada, and it's a definite cause of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So things there. Oh, I'll get another question here.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I'm wondering if there's research on, are you aware of any research that has looked at things in perfumes, colognes, hairsprays, like kind of chemical agents like that most people are exposed to? I mean, in the workplace and just in daily life on a daily basis.
I mean, my center is looking at nail salons because of the crazy chemicals that are used there.
Yeah.
We study workplace cancer, and there's an amazing number of nail salons now in Canada. I'm just blown away by them. Most of them are staffed by relatively new immigrants that don't know about health protections or are pretty vulnerable, we believe. So we focused in on them. It's not my area of research to look at these other areas, but certainly, it wouldn't surprise me if there are issues there. They're just not my area of research.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions for Paul?
I have a question. You showed the slide about asbestos cancer exposures in the map of Canada. And so we think of the culprit of asbestos Quebec as a hotspot. But I was kind of surprised that Ontario wasn't that far behind Quebec in exposures. Are there hotspots in Ontario, or is it just like building upgrades and that kind of thing, that there's more generalized exposure in the construction thing? Or are there hotspots?
Well, a lot of our asbestos exposure happens in construction, and construction is everywhere. And that really is our major source. The difference in Quebec is that they had a much bigger mining industry, and then they were producing so they had more manufacturing that used asbestos products. But that manufacturing was all over the place historically. I sometimes show a slide of the crazy stuff, fake snow for under trees. That was chrysotile asbestos. We used to scatter that around. It really was considered long after we should have known better, and we've known about the health effects of asbestos. We've known clearly about most of the health effects of asbestos, including cancer, since the 1950s. Some of the effects we've known even longer than that. We continue to use asbestos for a lot of crazy stuff.
Are General Electric workers in Peterborough just taking it home for insulation for their houses? Isn't there an issue with that, like even in the courts these days?
There is, and now there's, they were selling it as a benefit to their workers. As they were pulling it out of the facility, they were saying, oh, you can get asbestos cheap and take it home with you to insulate your home. As I understand it, GE is quietly compensating people on the side for that now, even though there was a bit of denial that it was happening. But the person who drove the truck to deliver the stuff said, hey, I know what happened, I know which houses I delivered to. So it's really pretty crazy stuff that went on. I remember I worked on a study of asbestos miners in Newfoundland. At the local school, they built a paper mache model of the town. It wasn't paper mache, it was asbestos mache. And this was, it wasn't in so far of a history of going back that there shouldn't have been somebody saying something. But even the managers of the plant didn't know the full truth about asbestos. So it was much more widely used in different areas of manufacturing. And we have some other notorious facilities in Ontario. The Holmes Foundry, which is in Sarnia as well. And there's a few other facilities as well.
Time for one or two more questions for Paul. This is your chance. We've got the expert here in Regina with us.
Yeah, unfortunately, you don't have a back door to escape here. But I'll stick around if people want to ask me one-on-one as well.
Well, Paul, thank you very much for taking the time to speak here this afternoon.
Thank
Much
you.
appreciated. Thank you.